They said no good ever came from a stranger's knock after dark, especially in a raw frontier town perched on the edge of the Great Plains. But Catherine Haverford, a young widow with a spine of steel, had lived through too many dusty sunsets and lonely nights to ignore another soul's cry for help. The moment she unbolted her cabin door and peered out, she met the eyes of a wounded Lakota man, struggling to remain upright. Little did she know this single act of compassion would thrust her into a whirlwind of secrets, betrayals, and redemptions, one that would redefine the fates of thousands. A hot wind blew across the dusty plain, stirring tumbleweeds across the single half-finished road that bisected the fledgling town of Grayton's Gulch. It was 1877, not long after the upheaval of the Great Sioux War. Beyond the clapboard church and the newly erected telegraph office stretching into an endless horizon were the rolling grasslands of what settlers called the Dakota Territory. Locals claimed that once the wind started, it never truly died. It only waited half asleep for unsuspecting passers-by. On the outskirts, a single log cabin stood defiant against the savage sweep of the prairies. It belonged to Catherine Haverford, a woman in her mid-20s with dark brown hair bound in a single braid, an inherited ranch from her late husband, and a spirit tempered by heartbreak. She had married young at the tender age of 16 to a tall dreamer named John Haverford. But John had fallen ill after only 5 years of marriage, his final breath carried away by a winter so ruthless it stole the lives of half the town. In that battered cabin, Catherine lived alone. Night after night, she fixed her gaze on the horizon, fighting off regrets that might consume her. Grayton's Gulch had grown slightly in the last year. There was talk of a railroad spur that might push through, but the community was still small enough to watch warily whenever a new rider trotted in, especially if he didn't speak English. Legends crept along the edges of campfires and over whiskey glasses at the saloon. Lakota warriors, who once roamed these plains, still lurked nearby waiting to strike. Some men, like Marshal Henry R. Thompson, who had traveled far and wide, believed in forging peace with the Lakota. Others insisted that the only good Indian was a defeated one. Tensions flared whenever wild rumors of stolen cattle or missing scouts floated through the wind. 2 days prior, Catherine had noticed riders in the distance U.S. cavalry, led by Colonel James W. Forsyth. Their presence unsettled her. Once she had tried to inquire politely at the general store if anyone knew the reason for their patrols. She received only tight-lipped shrugs. War had ended, some said. Yet others insisted trouble was brewing again. Catherine, for her part, trusted her instincts. Something was stirring across these plains. She could feel it in the way her hens clucked nervously at dusk, and how her few remaining cattle grew restless at odd hours. As a widow, Catherine found independence a double-edged sword. She was free to oversee her small patch of land as she pleased, to greet the morning sun by her lonely fence, to water her meager vegetable garden without a father or husband telling her otherwise. But her vulnerability did not go unnoticed. More than once, drifters had attempted to swindle her out of a day's labor, and ranchers like Russell Kane, who held property a few miles away, made veiled threats about how a lady couldn't possibly tend a homestead alone. That night, just past midnight, when Catherine heard a scratching on her door, every cautionary tale of marauding thieves or desperate vagrants flashed through her mind. Gun in hand, barefoot across the rough floorboards, she approached. In the faint lamplight, she saw something she least expected: a Lakota man, clearly injured, barely able to remain upright. She unbolted the door, heart pounding. His dark hair clung to his face, and a crimson stain showed through the side of his buckskin shirt. Blood trickled down, forming a small puddle at his feet. "Help," he rasped, though the word was not in English. His eyes, the color of coffee at dawn, were intense but clouded with pain. Whether out of simple human decency or a deeper stirring of empathy, she herself did not understand. Catherine gently led him inside. Catherine had nursed John through the last months of his illness, learning what tinctures eased fevers and which herbs might slow bleeding. She had not mastered the intricacies of medicine, but she knew enough to clean and bandage a wound. That night, as the wind hissed outside like a jealous spirit, she lowered the Lakota man onto her late husband's old armchair. He was tall, though currently slack with exhaustion. His breathing was labored, and he clutched his stand where blood continued to seep. Catherine retrieved her sewing kit and a bottle of whiskey, the same brand John had once used as a last resort for son. Then, with trembling but determined hands, she cut away the soiled shirt. Beneath a bullet wound blossomed angry and dark near the ribs. She poured whiskey onto a clean rag and pressed it against the wound to stave off infection. The stranger flinched his entire body, jerking away for a moment. Catherine whispered soothingly, recalling how her mother used to calm her as a child. They were barely words, more a gentle hush that signaled she intended no harm. In the flicker of lamplight, Catherine noted faint tattoos on his forearms, symbols of a tribe she recognized from stories, but could not fully decipher. Small scars traced across his shoulders and chest, testament to a warrior's life. Despite the lines of pain etched across his face, he bore a noble mien that startled her. He was not just any Lakota wanderer or renegade. There was an air of quiet authority surrounding him. Softly, Catherine dabbed a fresh rag across his brow. "I'm Catherine," she said, trying to catch his gaze. "Can you tell me your name?" He struggled to find his voice. She offered him a sip of water. At last he mumbled something that sounded like "Toka Shah," though she was not certain she heard it right. She repeated it in a careful whisper, and he merely nodded. It was not lost on her that harboring a Lakota man could bring her trouble. Rumors spread quickly, and vigilantes in Grayton's Gulch were always itching for a reason to rally. But she cast aside those worries, at least for that moment. An injured man lay before her, and she refused to let prejudice and her own fear take precedence over a person's life. By the time she finished bandaging him, it was nearing dawn. The night sky had shifted from indigo to a pale grey. The Lakota man Toka Shah had slipped into a fitful sleep, occasionally groaning in pain. Catherine rose from the chair, her back stiff. Every moment of rest she might have grasped that night had evaporated into the haze of worry and compassion. Stepping outside briefly, she inhaled the chill air and exhaled a trembling sigh. She peered into the distance, expecting to see some sign of pursuit, a distant campfire or columns of smoke. But the landscape remained quiet, except for the wind which grazed over the grasses like a giant invisible hand. In the month since John's passing, Catherine had seldom entertained visitors. On one occasion, her old friend Martha Farnham had travelled from Miles City to spend a week with her, doing what she could to help Catherine sort out John's remaining debts. Martha's compassion had eased Catherine's sorrow, reminding her that she was not wholly alone in this harsh country. But those days had ended. Now confronted with an even greater challenge, Catherine wondered if she should send word to the local marshal or keep Toka Shah's presence hidden. She returned inside, carefully shutting the door. The man had stilled his breath, shallow but steady. Catherine placed a blanket over him, then slumped onto the nearby bench, exhaustion overtaking her. Sleep claimed her for just a short hour, during which she dreamed of storm clouds rolling across the plains and a lone figure standing atop a ridge cloaked in the feathers of a mighty eagle. Morning brought no respite. The sun, fierce and unyielding, illuminated Catherine's cabin with a harsh clarity that revealed every cracked floorboard and every swirl of dust drifting in the corners. She awakened to hear faint murmurs from the man. Tokash's eyes fluttered open, pain intensifying his expression as he tried to shift upright. Catherine quickly moved to his side. "Easy," she said, offering him a cup of water. "You've lost blood." He hesitated, surveying his surroundings. With a trembling hand, he accepted the water and sipped. A single question burned in his gaze. "Where am I, and who is this woman?" Catherine, sensing his uncertainty, tried to smile reassuringly. "I found you at my door last night," she said, slowly, enunciating the English words, but also gesturing to the door. She touched the bandage at his side, then mimed shooting a rifle, followed by a gesture that implied he had been hurt. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. He nodded, lifting the blanket slightly to see the thick cloth bandage. Looking at Catherine, he said haltingly, "Thank you." She gave a shallow nod. "Rest," she replied in a gentle tone, placing a calming hand on his shoulder. Language barriers aside, they shared a universal understanding he was in no condition to run, and she was not going to cast him out. Her stomach churned with hunger, reminding her that she had not eaten since the previous afternoon. She prepared a modest breakfast of beans and biscuits, left over from what she had baked the day before. The aroma wafted through the cabin. She offered some to Tokasha, who tasted it slowly, evidently wary, but grateful. Amid the sparse furnishings, the battered wood stove and the trunk at the foot of her bed, Catherine felt a strange tension. No more did she walk these floors alone. Every breath from the Lakota man reminded her of the precariousness of their situation. If the wrong person discovered him here, it might spark retaliation. Yet something in Tokasha's composed demeanor told her he was not simply a desperate wanderer. The subtle lines in his cheeks, the quiet intelligence in his gaze, the respectful way he accepted her help. He carried himself like a man who had known both suffering and honor. She spent the rest of the morning tending to her chores, stepping outside to gather eggs from the chickens and check on the single cow that remained after a harsh winter. When she returned, Tokasha was hunched over a small piece of paper in his hand. She noticed it was a corner torn from the local newspaper, something John used to keep in an old trunk. Tokasha studied the text, eyebrows furrowing in confusion. A gentle idea sparked within her. She lifted a pencil from a nearby crate, and on the backside of the paper, she wrote her name, Catherine, in a neat cursive. Pointing to herself, she sounded out, "Catherine." He hesitated, then repeated the word as best he could, his accent rolling over the syllables. She nodded, smiling. "Yes, Catherine." Then she offered him the pencil. He paused, unsure at first, then gingerly took it. Slowly, with a hand still shaking from weakness, he drew a Lakota symbol. It looked like a stylized turtle. Then beneath it, in uneven letters, he wrote, "Tokasha." "Is that you?" she asked, pointing. He nodded. Something tugged at her heart, a quiet sense of awe that they had bridged a small gap between their worlds. But as the sun inched higher, Catherine's heartbeat quickened. The day would bring visitors, perhaps Russell Kane checking on her property line, or the traveling peddler Sam Jenkins who roamed from cabin to cabin. She would have to ensure no one suspected she was harboring a wounded Lakota man. Outside, the approaching drone of hooves echoed. Catherine's nerves tensed. She hurried to the window and glimpsed a rider on the distant road. He wore a broad-brimmed hat, but she couldn't be sure who it was. Likely a rancher or a messenger. Quick as a rabbit, she spun around to Toka Shah and lifted a finger to her lips, signaling for silence. The man nodded in understanding. Catherine dashed outside, shutting the door gently behind her. Her heart pounded as she strode toward the fence, pretending to check on her horse. The rider came closer, revealing himself to be none other than Russell Kane, a burly rancher with sunburnt cheeks and a suspicious squint. "Mornin', Mrs. Haverford," he called, reining in his mare. "All well out here?" Catherine forced a polite smile. "Good morning, Mr. Kane." Doing the usual chores. He rested an arm on his saddle horn. "Just riding the perimeter, making sure there ain't been no trouble." He paused, eyes wandering to her cabin. "Everything sure looks quiet." Catherine sensed his gaze lingering too long. "Yes, everything's fine. Just me and the ranch." Kane grunted. "I heard the cavalry came through, scouting for some runaway Lakota group. Folks in town say we might have stragglers around. You see anything unusual? Maybe footprints or a campfire?" Her heart hammered. The memory of Toka Shah's bullet wound hung in her mind's eye. "No, I haven't seen anything." She managed, swallowing her anxiety. Kane frowned as though he could smell deception. But after a moment he shrugged. "Well, keep a watch, and if you need help," he let the offer dangle an undercurrent of condescension in his tone. "I will thank you," Catherine replied. With a jerk of his reins, Kane spurred his mare onward, continuing down the dusty track. Catherine waited until his silhouette vanished over the next rise, before she exhaled the breath she had been holding. This was only day one, and already she felt the tension that might rip her world apart. She had made her choice, and there was no easy turning back. Sunset stained the horizon in crimson and gold, while Catherine fussed over Toka Shah's bandage, removing the old cloth and applying fresh boiled water to cleanse the wound. His fever had gone down, but his body still shivered at intervals. His hair, once braided, now lay in tangles around his broad shoulders. Over the course of that long day, she had learned more about him through gestures and halting bits of speech. He understood some English phrases enough to nod or frown at the mention of soldiers. When Catherine pointed to the bullet wound and mouthed, "Who his face darkened," he spoke one word with clear bitterness: "Forsyth." Catherine recognized that name, Colonel James W. Forsyth. She'd heard of him leading cavalry patrols around these territories, rumored to be on edge about rumored Lakota unrest. If Toka Shah had been shot by those soldiers, it meant he was definitely on the run. Yet Catherine still did not grasp Toka Shah's significance. Why was he alone? Where was his family or tribe? Each question carved a deeper worry in her mind. She found herself remembering hushed stories from her childhood. The Lakota were proud people known to be fierce protectors of their land. Some refused to give up the fight. Others, forced onto reservations, lived in abject despair. With Toka Shah stable enough to hold a short conversation, Catherine decided to risk further communication attempts. She brought out her old trunk, rummaging until she found her father's dog-eared dictionary, an incomplete but somewhat useful reference. Placing it between them on the kitchen table, she flipped to certain words. She pointed to Wound Chief Family Danger, and then tried to see if any sparked recognition. He traced the word chief thoughtfully, then placed a palm against his chest. "Taku wakang thanka," he said, shaking his head as though frustrated that she might not understand. "My father." He added the English phrase thick on his tongue. Catherine pressed her lips together. Father was a chief. She scrambled through the dictionary, searching for synonyms of chief. She found leader, head, ruler. Toka Shah touched leader and nodded. Could it be that Toka Shah came from a line of Lakota leaders? A swirl of possibilities filled her mind. She had read that certain Lakota chiefs commanded the loyalty of hundreds, even thousands, though these were sometimes romanticized rumors carried by newspapers from the East. Perhaps Toka Shah was significant in ways she could not yet fathom. The lamp burned low, and Catherine rose to feed it more oil. She then warmed more broth for Toka Shah, coaxing him to drink. He complied, though his strength was still precarious. He lowered the cup after a few sips, eyes meeting hers with a grateful softness she had never seen before. Then an unexpected moment of levity. Toka Shah, struggling with the dictionary, pointed to woman, then pointed to strong, then pointed to Catherine. He made a small grunt of approval, as if to say she was a strong woman indeed. Caught off guard, Catherine's cheeks warmed with an odd mixture of pride and embarrassment. She dipped her head, a small, shy smile crossing her lips. That night, after Toka Shah slipped into sleep, Catherine sat by the table, worry gnawing at her. If Forsyth or any cavalry patrol discovered him here, she would be labeled a traitor. Her homestead could be seized. She might even be thrown in jail. She thought of writing a letter to her friend, Martha Farnham, who lived in Miles City, but decided it was too risky to put any of this in ink. Sometimes she found her gaze drifting to John's old rocking chair, recalling the nights he spent reading dog-eared books about cattle ranching, or simply staring into the distance with that dreamer's soul of his. She silently asked for his guidance. John had been kinder to Lakota folks than most in Grayton's Gulch. If it had been him to open the door that night, he would have done the same thing, brought Toka Shah in no questions asked. Catherine resolved to keep Toka Shah hidden until he was well enough to travel. Afterward, she could only hope the Lakota man would find his way back to safety. That was the best she could do. 2 days passed with uneasy calm. Toka Shah's fever broke, allowing him to regain enough strength to move around the cabin carefully. He still coughed painfully if he exerted himself too much, but Catherine's makeshift nursing had prevented the wound from festering. Throughout those days, she kept him concealed whenever anyone approached. She lived in dread of knocks at her door, which came more frequently than usual. Sam Jenkins, the traveling peddler, dropped by, urging her to buy a miracle tonic. Catherine politely declined, mindful of Toka Shah, crouching behind the bed. The next afternoon, a far more disturbing caller arrived, Colonel James W. Forsyth himself, accompanied by a small detail of soldiers. Catherine spotted their approach from a window. Blue uniforms, upright postures, rifles slung across saddles. Her heart pounded so fiercely, she thought she might faint. She whispered urgently to Toka Shah, pointing to the bed and urging him to hide beneath it. She set down extra blankets to mask him. Then she drew a steadying breath and stepped outside, carefully shutting the door. Colonel Forsyth was a man in his 40s, with sharp eyes and a crisp, commanding voice. Behind him rode a few men with stern faces, scanning the homestead as though expecting an ambush. Afternoon. Colonel Catherine greeted, tipping her chin. "Ma'am." Forsyth dismounted, eyeing the property. "I'm told you live alone. That's correct?" "My husband passed on a year ago." He nodded somewhat stiffly. "My condolences. We're surveying these parts. There's been a report of a wounded native in the area. Have you come across anyone unusual?" "Mrs. Haverford." Catherine forced a neutral expression. "No, sir. I've been focusing on my chores. The only folks around here are the travelers passing through on the main road." Forsyth studied her, as if sifting her words for any falsehood. "We suspect this individual is part of a renegade Lakota band. They're scattered, but we believe they're trying to regroup with a leader who's gained influence on the plains. Goes by Toka Shah or something similar." "Have you heard that name, Mrs. Haverford?" The mention of Toka Shah's name jolted Catherine's pulse. She shook her head, keeping her tone even. "No, Colonel. I'm afraid I don't know anything about that." Forsyth's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, if you should see or hear of any suspicious persons, it's your duty to inform us. Sheltering an outlaw is a serious offense." "I understand," Catherine replied, her voice steady, despite her inner turmoil. He gave a curt nod, then gazed around. One of his soldiers glanced at the cabin door, as though preparing to dismount and look inside. Catherine's heart lurched. But Forsyth simply said, "Move out." The soldier hesitated, then obeyed the colonel's order. They spurred their horses away, leaving Catherine trembling in their wake. She waited until they disappeared over the horizon before dashing inside. Pulling aside the blankets, she found Toka Shah breathing heavily, pain etched in his features from straining to stay still. He looked at her with concern, but she offered a faint, reassuring smile. "They're gone." Slowly he slid out, leaning against the bed. Catherine handed him a cup of water, and he drank gratefully. Forsyth's parting words echoed in Catherine's mind. Sheltering an outlaw is a serious offense. Fear warred with resolve. She knew the risks now more than ever. Yet as she locked eyes with Toka Shah, a quiet understanding passed between them. Whatever Forsyth and others labeled him renegade, outlaw, savage, Catherine could not reconcile those words with the wounded man before her, who had spoken with gentle respect and shown her nothing but gratitude. In that moment, Catherine realized her life had irrevocably changed. She was no longer a mere widow trying to survive. She was a woman protecting a Lakota stranger who might carry the weight of a people on his shoulders. Despite her exhaustion and the daily tasks of tending the ranch, Catherine found herself drawn to nightly conversations with Toka Shah. With the cabin door locked and the world outside cloaked in darkness, they ventured deeper into each other's languages. Using the dictionary gestures and pictures, they pieced together fragments of stories. Catherine discovered that Toka Shah meant something akin to Red Warrior. She also gleaned that his father had once been a respected chief, leading several bands of the Lakota. Toka Shah himself had earned renown in battles against cavalry forces encroaching on Sioux lands. He spoke sorrowfully of the treaties broken by the U.S. government, of the hunting grounds, stripped bare of buffalo, of the hunger and despair that plagued his people. In hushed tones, Catherine reciprocated, telling him of her late husband John, how they had trekked west after the Civil War in search of farmland. She told him of the cholera that struck Grayton's Gulch, stealing lives and leaving her a widow. She spoke of her struggle to keep the ranch afloat, the men who tried to take advantage of her vulnerability, and the stony resilience she wore each day, like armor. Sometimes they simply sat in companionable silence, the flickering lantern casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. The intimacy of those shared nights, the soft hush of their voices, the sincerity in their eyes. It bonded them beyond words. On the third night of these quiet confessions, Toka Shah mustered the strength to step outside into the moonlight. Catherine helped him, steadying him as he leaned against the porch railing. The air was crisp, and a vast canopy of stars stretched overhead like scattered diamonds. He pointed to the sky, naming constellations in his native tongue. Catherine recognized only a few. She found herself enthralled not merely by the lesson, but by the gentle reverence in his voice as he spoke of the heavens. In that stillness, he turned to her, voice low. "Thank you," he said, his English more confident than before. "I not a savage." He tapped his own chest as though referencing all the slander heaped upon his people. "I love my land, my family. I fight for them for freedom." Catherine's throat tightened. "I know," she whispered. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled its plaintive cry, echoing across the plains. Toka Shah winced, perhaps from pain, or perhaps from the memories that haunted him. Catherine felt an urge to place her hand on his arm to convey comfort, but she hesitated, unsure if it would be welcomed. He spared her the decision, gently taking her hand in his. His touch was warm, the rough calluses telling of a warrior's life. A silent moment passed between them, charged with understanding and something deeper that neither could readily name. When they returned inside, Toka Shah tested his mobility around the cabin. He could stand straighter now, though sharp pangs still shot through his side. Catherine insisted he not push himself too hard. He gave a small nod, sinking back into the armchair. Before she drifted off to her small bed, Catherine turned down the lantern. She watched Toka Shah's eyes gleam in the semi-darkness, a swirl of gratitude and guarded hope. In her heart, she wondered if she was no longer just a caretaker or nurse. In some indefinable way, they were forging a bond against the backdrop of a land that had proven brutal to both of them. In the days that followed, the situation around Grayton's Gulch grew tense. Rumors circulated of small raids by Lakota bands seeking supplies. Marshal Henry R. Thompson convened the townsfolk in the saloon one evening, urging calm. But men like Russell Kane, fueled by prejudice and fear, began advocating for drastic measures. "I say we take a posse and sweep the area," Kane declared, loudly pounding his fist on a table. "If there's any Indians hiding out here, we bring 'em in, dead or alive. It's the only way to protect ourselves." Some nodded in agreement, but others hesitated, uncertain if such aggression would merely stoke further violence. Catherine, who had ventured into town for supplies, lingered at the edge of the crowd. Heart pounding, she kept her wide-brimmed hat low, hoping not to draw attention. Kane's gaze flickered toward her. "Mrs. Haverford," he called, "you're mighty quiet. You got any news from that lonely ranch of yours?" She forced a tight-lipped smile. "No news, Mr. Kane. Just trying to mind my own business." He snorted. "Well, if you do happen to see any redskins prowling around, you best let us know. Don't want to end up like your husband." Several gasps rippled through the crowd. Catherine's face paled, fury and anguish clashing within her. She wanted to shout, to protest how monstrous his insinuation was. But she dared not tip her hand. She swallowed hard, then turned on her heel and marched out, feeling the weight of a dozen stares on her back. Back at the ranch, she paced anxiously. Toka Shah, sensing her distress, stood from the armchair. He could walk more easily now, the bullet wound healing bit by bit. She recounted the scene in the saloon, her voice shaking with anger. Kane is dangerous, she concluded. He wants blood, and he won't stop until he finds someone to blame. Toka Shah listened intently, piecing together her explanation from the words he understood and her expressions. At last he spoke in a low, determined tone. I must go. Soon. Catherine's chest tightened. She had known this moment would come the day he would be strong enough to leave. And yet the thought of him walking into the path of Forsyth's men or into a violent confrontation with settlers made her stomach churn. Where will you go? She asked. He exhaled heavily. I must find my people. They wait for me. He hesitated, searching for the right English words. I have duty. Help them. Protect them. She nodded slowly, understanding. His place was among his people, who were likely scattered and in peril, but a flicker of concern laced her voice. When how? His jaw tightened in resolve. In 2 days. Maybe 3. Need horse. Catherine chewed her lip, pondering how to procure one without drawing suspicion. She had one sturdy mare named Clover, but she needed that horse for her own ranch work. Perhaps she could part with it for Toka Shah's sake. Or maybe she could bargain with Sam Jenkins for a second horse, though that would require explaining why she needed another. In the hush of the late afternoon, Toka Shah asked a question in halting English. You, come with me. Her eyes widened in surprise. The suggestion jolted her. What? He gestured outside at the wide plains. There is war coming. Maybe not tomorrow, but soon. This land, not safe for Lakota or for you. If they find me here, they hurt you. Toka Shah's concern for her well-being touched a vulnerable place in Catherine's heart. She had no illusions about how precarious her position was. Yet this ranch, for all its hardships, had been her home with John, the only life she had known for years. To abandon it to ride off with Toka Shah into the unknown was unthinkable and strangely tempting. She lowered her gaze. I don't know, she whispered. This is my home, John's resting place. I can't just leave. Toka Shah studied her face, a gentle sadness in his dark eyes. He nodded in understanding, not pressing further. But a quiet tension filled the cabin, as though both recognized they were at the edge of a decision that would change their destinies. That night, Catherine barely slept. She awoke at the faintest sound of horses in the distance, half convinced that a search party was descending upon the ranch. But each time she realized it was only the soft rustling of wind or the low bellow of a distant steer. The following day she resolved to find a second horse for Toka Shah. Carefully she saddled Clover, then guided the mare to the main road. Before leaving, she left Toka Shah with instructions to stay hidden and to keep the rifle handy in case of emergencies. She also worried about leaving him alone for so many hours. But she saw no alternative. Riding into Grayton's Gulch, she considered her options. Sam Jenkins was out of town for another week at least. The only place she might find a horse quickly was at the livery stable, run by an old man named Albert Morley. But Morley would surely ask questions, especially since Catherine had rarely shown interest in buying livestock from him before. As she dismounted near the livery, her mind whirled with potential excuses. A second horse to manage errands, or maybe she wanted to hire a stable hand. She just needed a plausible story that wouldn't rouse suspicion. Before she could step inside, she noticed a group of men gathered in front of the general store, Russell Kane among them. They were deep in conversation with 2 cavalry soldiers. Catherine quickly looked away, pretending not to see them. Her stomach churned. Any misstep could lead them to her ranch. Inside the livery, The heavy smell of hay and manure greeted her. Albert Morley stooped with age, but sharp-eyed looked up from grooming a sorrel gelding. Mrs. Haverford he greeted with mild surprise. "What brings you here?" She forced a polite smile. "I need a horse, Mr. Morley. A sturdy one, not too expensive." He rubbed his chin, studying her. "You planning on expanding your ranching?" She shrugged, feigning nonchalance. "Maybe. I realized I can't do everything with just one horse. And, well, I've saved up a little." Morley nodded thoughtfully. "I've got a mare here, Lucy calm enough for a lady, but strong. Came in a few days back from a traveling cowboy who owed me money. She's not a beauty, but she'll do." Catherine pretended to examine Lucy, a chestnut mare, with tired eyes. She asked a few cursory questions, then named a price. Morley countered. They haggled for a few minutes before settling on an amount steep enough to strain Catherine's meager savings. Still, she agreed, anxious to leave before Kane or the soldiers spotted her. As she led Lucy out, Morley gave her a quizzical glance. "You sure you want her delivered?" "Usually you'd just ride her out." Catherine forced a quick smile. "I rode Clover in. I'll come back for Lucy soon, maybe tomorrow or the next day. If you can stable her until then, I'll pay for feed." Morley shrugged. "Suit yourself, ma'am. I'll keep her ready." Relieved, Catherine mounted Clover and headed out of town. But as she passed the general store, Kane's voice rang out. "Mrs. Haverford." Her insides knotted. She reined in, turning slowly to face him. "Yes." Kane strode over, flanked by one of Forsyth's soldiers. The soldier tipped his hat politely, but his eyes remained stern. "I hear you're in the market for an extra horse," Kane drawled. "Planning on taking a long trip?" Catherine mustered a tight smile. "I just need another horse for the ranch. Nothing more." Kane chuckled, though there was no warmth in his eyes. "You know, with all these rumors swirling about renegade Lakota, I'd be careful. A single woman might find herself in over her head." She stiffened, meeting his gaze. "I appreciate your concern, but I'll manage." The soldier cleared his throat. "Ma'am, if you see anything suspicious or run into anyone who doesn't belong, I'll inform the proper authorities," Catherine finished briskly. "Now if you'll excuse me." Without waiting for a response, she guided Clover away, heart pounding. The tension in Kane's voice was a warning. He suspected something, or at least was itching to find fault with her. She left town as quickly as she could without appearing frantic. Upon reaching the ranch, Catherine discovered Toka Shah outside, leaning against the porch. He held the rifle loosely at his side, scanning the horizon. Relief flooded her as he turned at her approach, eyes filling with concern. "Trouble?" he asked softly. She dismounted, glancing around to confirm they were alone. "Not yet, but Kane is suspicious. We have to be careful." He nodded gravely, then gestured at the open plains. "I leave tonight," he declared, surprising her. "Moon is bright. I can go." Her chest tightened at the sudden finality of his decision. "Are you strong enough?" He drew a breath, wincing slightly. "Yes. Better to go before they come." Catherine wanted to protest that traveling at night might be dangerous, that his wound could slow him down, but she understood that every hour he stayed put increased the risk. She glanced at Clover, then back at Toka Shah. "Wait until morning at least. I can bring a second horse tomorrow from Morley. You shouldn't travel alone on foot." But Toka Shah shook his head. "No time." He touched his side, then gazed at Catherine with quiet resolution. I run. They chase me, not you. Emotion swelled in her throat. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to the midnight conversations, the sense of camaraderie in a world that had so often left her lonely. Now he was leaving to vanish into the plains, possibly into mortal danger. She managed a trembling nod. All right. Then let me help you pack what you need. Food bandages, anything that will keep you safe. His eyes shone with gratitude. Together in the twilight that spread across the ranch, they prepared for his departure. Catherine wrapped bread, dried beans, and a canteen of water in a knapsack. She insisted he take John's old hunting knife, worn but still sharp. When the moon rose, painting the land in silver, Toka Shah gathered the supplies. He paused at the threshold of the cabin, turning to face her. Their eyes locked in a moment that transcended words. He brushed his fingers over her cheek, a gesture of respect and quiet fondness. Thank you, he murmured. You saved my life. A lump formed in Catherine's throat. Please, be careful. He nodded. Then, without further hesitation, he stepped into the night. Catherine watched as his figure receded into the shadows, each step straining but determined. A lone silhouette against the rolling plains, heading north or west, she couldn't tell. When at last she could see him no more, she pressed a trembling hand to her lips. She whispered a silent prayer for him, a man she had known for just a short time, but who had left an imprint on her soul. Then she closed the cabin door, leaning against it as tears pricked her eyes. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the echoes of a warrior on a perilous journey. Catherine spent the next day in a haze. She half expected Toka Shah to return collapsing at her doorstep once more. But evening came and went, leaving her alone, her mind churning with worry. She was milking the cow when she heard a distant shout. Riding up to her ranch at a breakneck pace was a cavalry scout. Panic surged. She quickly wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, heart pounding. The scout skidded to a halt, dust swirling around his horse. His face was flushed words, tumbling in agitation. Ma'am, have you seen an Indian pass through here? Colonel Forsyth's orders. Catherine's blood ran cold. She forced a calm expression. No. I've been busy here all day. He spat in frustration. We found tracks near the stream and some blood. We think the savage is wounded. Catherine shrugged, feigning ignorance. No one's come by. Maybe he went north. The scout glared in the direction of her cabin. We'll be searching the area. If you're lying, it won't go well for you. She suppressed the urge to recoil, schooling her face into neutrality. Search if you must. He dismounted, glancing around her property. For an agonizing 10 minutes he poked around the barn, the chicken coop, and even peered inside her home. Catherine's breath caught in her throat as he surveyed the small bed, the armchair, the corners where Toka Shah once hid. Finding nothing, he finally departed. Yet as she watched him ride away, a dread sank into her bones. They were close. If Toka Shah hadn't already slipped far enough away, the cavalry might catch him soon. Her attempts at daily tasks felt hollow. Days rolled by, each one thick with tension. Whenever she ventured into Grayton's Gulch, she caught fragments of alarming conversations. They say Colonel Forsyth's found an entire camp of Lakota, led by some big chief. Heard a big clash might happen soon. There's talk of more soldiers heading this way, maybe from Fort Keogh. Marshal Thompson tried to keep the peace, but Russell Kane and his ilk grew more vocal, demanding that any local who harbored Indians be prosecuted. A rumor even circulated that Catherine's ranch was too quiet, which fanned suspicion. Haunted by the possibility that Toka Shah might be caught in a violent confrontation, Catherine withdrew deeper into herself. Nights were the worst. She would stare at the flickering lamplight, recalling his earnest eyes, his gentle hand on hers. She prayed that he had reached safety, or that he had found his people. One morning, a terrifying discovery jolted her from bed tracks around her barn. Hoofprints she didn't recognize. Investigating, she found the padlock on the barn door tampered with. Someone had tried to break in. Had it been bandits looking for supplies? Or Kane's men searching for evidence of Toka Shah's presence? Frustrated and fearful, Catherine bolted her doors and windows, peering out each night at the moonlit plains. Though she hated the feeling of isolation, she saw no alternative. A week passed without major incident, though tension in Grayton's Gulch soared. One afternoon, Catherine received a surprising visit from Marshal Henry R. Thompson himself. He rode up the road, dust caking his boots. She stood on the porch, arms folded protectively. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Haverford, I'd like a word, if you don't mind." Her pulse quickened. "Certainly, Marshal." He dismounted, hitching his horse to the fence. "I know you've been keeping to yourself, but we've got trouble. Forsyth's men have been skirmishing with a Lakota band to the southwest. They say the band is led by Toka Shah, a young chief. He's rumored to have rallied over 1,000 warriors, though who knows how much of that is just talk. Folks are worried. I've been asked to gather as many civilians as possible into town if things escalate." Catherine's heart hammered at the mention of Toka Shah as a chief. Not just a warrior, but a leader of 1,000. The stories had been true. She forced herself to remain calm. "What does that mean for us out here?" The marshal's face was grave. "If Toka Shah's band is heading this way, or if Forsyth decides to bring his fight here, we could see an all-out battle. Women and children might be safer in the center of town. I'm asking you, Mrs. Haverford, to consider coming in until this blows over." She felt torn. On the one hand, the ranch was her livelihood. If she abandoned it, she risked losing everything. On the other hand, staying put might place her squarely in the path of violence, and she couldn't deny the swirl of emotions at hearing Toka Shah's name, the knowledge that he might be leading his people in a desperate stand. "I need time to think," she replied, voice low. Marshal Thompson nodded. "I understand. But don't wait too long. If the cavalry organizes an offensive, they won't wait for anyone to pack up. And if Toka Shah's warriors decide to raid, they could hit the outskirts first." Catherine's eyes flickered with anxiety. "Thank you for the warning." He started to leave, then paused. "Mrs. Haverford, I know you're a good person. If you need help, come find me." His gaze lingered, as though implying he suspected more than he let on. Then he mounted and rode away. Alone again, Catherine sank onto the porch step, pressing her palms to her eyes. Toka Shah was indeed a chief of his people, perhaps newly ascended after his father's passing. The cavalry was closing and tension was building, and she was caught in the middle. That evening, she made a decision. She would not run to Grayton's Gulch. Instead, she loaded her wagon with crucial supplies, grain-dried food water barrels, determined to hold out on her ranch. It was a gamble, but the idea of leaving behind John's homestead felt like a betrayal. She fortified the cabin as best she could, nailing planks over the windows in case of stray bullets. Her rifle was kept loaded, though she prayed she would never have to use it. Each slam of the hammer echoed her growing resolve. She might be alone, but she would defend her home. The next morning, a deep rumble echoed across the plains. Not thunder, but distant gunfire. Catherine climbed to the barn roof with John's old spyglass. Far out dust clouds swirled and tiny figures moved in flurries of battle. Cavalry and Lakota warriors clashed too distant to tell who had the upper hand. By mid-afternoon, she spotted a group of Lakota riders heading east in what seemed like retreat. Among them, Toka Shah. Even from a distance, she recognized his proud posture. Her breath caught as he raised an arm to signal, then disappeared behind a knoll. Moments later, cavalry thundered into view, chasing the Lakota. Gunshots rang out. Catherine ducked inside as bullets struck near her cabin splinters, flying from the barn walls. Then came chaos, Forsyth himself charging toward her ranch with troopers. Toka Shah's horse was struck, throwing him violently to the ground. Catherine's heart in her throat ran outside. "Stop!" she screamed, placing herself between Forsyth and the wounded warrior. Forsyth reined in, stunned. "Stand aside! He's a wanted renegade! This is my land!" Catherine yelled. "He's hurt! Let him go!" Toka Shah struggled upright, rifle in hand. His warriors circled the ranch, weapons drawn. Tension gripped the air, a single shot away from disaster. Then salvation. Marshal Thompson arrived at full gallop. "Hold your fire!" he bellowed. Both sides hesitated. Thompson turned to Forsyth. "Let's end this before it turns into a massacre." Forsyth's jaw clenched. "We want him in custody." Toka Shah bloodied refused. "Never." The marshal looked to him. "Negotiate. No more killing." Toka Shah signaled to his warriors. Slowly, they lowered their weapons. Forsyth's men followed suit, albeit reluctantly. In the uneasy silence, the wind stirred dust through the bullet-scarred yard. A fragile truce had been struck for now. Catherine dropped to her knees beside Toka Shah. His pain etched deep, but his spirit unbroken. Marshal Thompson took charge, urging both sides to stand down. Catherine knelt beside Toka Shah, checking the scrape from his fall. His eyes met hers, grateful but exhausted. Tension hung heavy as negotiations began. Forsyth demanded surrender and relocation to a reservation. Toka Shah refused, accusing the army of broken promises and starvation. It was clear things could ignite again at any moment. Catherine stepped forward. Holding out John's old Union Army pendant, she said firmly, "You serve your country, Colonel, as John did." But he believed in keeping one's word. If treaties were broken, that shame isn't just on him. Forsyth stiffened. That man led raids. She didn't back down. "You want justice, then show it. Let them leave in peace, or more blood will stain this land." Some soldiers looked to Forsyth weary. Toka Shah stood silent but strong. Marshal Thompson seized the chance. "They won't surrender, but we can end this without more death." After a tense pause, Forsyth relented. "Fine. Escort them out. But if we see them again, it's war." Toka Shah responded coldly, "We remember." With that, Thompson arranged for the Lakota to move north. Catherine helped Toka Shah to his feet. His old wound throbbed, but he was alive. One of his warriors led over a spare horse, and with effort Toka Shah mounted. Before he left, he turned to Catherine. "You saved me, and my people." Tears stung her eyes. She grasped his hand. Stay safe." Their gaze held filled with all the words they couldn't speak. Then Tokashar rode off with his warriors, followed by Thompson's escort. Forsyth gave Catherine one last look, his glare sharp with resentment, then followed his men. The ranch fell quiet. Dust settled. Catherine stood amidst the wreckage, heart heavy but relieved. Her land bore scars, but a war had been avoided for now. Tokashar was gone, and though their paths had split, she knew their bond would endure, carried on the wind that swept across the plains. In the days after the skirmish, Catherine threw herself into repairs. Bullet holes pocked the barn fences lay splintered, but neighbors arrived to help, perhaps, stirred by rumors of the battle or out of silent respect. Even Russell Kane showed up, saying little his usual arrogance dimmed. Marshal Thompson visited soon after with news Tokashar and his people had safely reached the northern foothills. "They're out of our jurisdiction now," he said. "Forsyth won't pursue as long as they stay clear of settlements." Relief filled Catherine. She imagined Tokashar leading his warriors under open skies beyond cavalry reach. As summer waned, Catherine resumed her routines, mending fences, tending to animals. But something in her had changed. She wasn't just a widow anymore. She had defied fear, protected a man the world called an enemy, and survived the storm. One afternoon, a package arrived from her friend Martha in Miles City. A blanket, a letter, and an offer of shelter. Catherine considered it, then tucked it away. She wouldn't leave. Later, while gardening, she found a stone arrowhead buried in the soil. She held it tightly, recalling Tokashar's stories and the reverence in his voice. A quiet smile formed. She had not just survived, she had stood for something. Thank you for listening to the story of Catherine Haverford and Chief Tokashar. Two souls destined to meet on a lonely frontier, where a single act of compassion changed the fate of countless lives. If their journey taught us anything, it's that courage and understanding can triumph over fear and division. Even in the harshest of times, a small spark of humanity can light the way toward hope. If you found this tale inspiring, please hit the like button, share it with friends, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue sharing stories of resilience, empathy, and untamed adventure. Together, let's keep the spirit of the Wild West alive, where unlikely allies can meet under the same sky and discover the unbreakable bond that only true compassion can forge. Stay tuned for more epic sagas.